Thank you very much. Before we start, I want to thank Jennifer because this paper, I wrote Jennifer a few weeks ago and I said, I have all this information on rhino poaching and I don't know what to do with it. Will you please meet with me? And so we went out to lunch. And so some of the framing of this talk very much came out of the conversation with Jennifer. So thank you, Jennifer, for your generous time. Okay, so let me see if, there we go. So earlier this year, January 11th to be exact, South African National Parks, or SANParks, it's the organization that organizes, regulates all the parks in South Africa, they issued a media release saying that the carcasses of 8 rhinos had been found inside South Africa's Kruger National Park. Kruger, which you can see here, is this park here. This is South Africa. Zimbabwe's up here, and Mozambique is here. And the sort of spatiality of that is actually quite important to this talk. So 8 rhino carcasses had been found inside Kruger, and their horns had been severed. So it provided very clear evidence that these were not natural deaths, but that the rhinos had in fact been poached. And this was a sobering way to begin the new year, because the previous year, in 2011, 448 rhinos had been poached in South Africa, and over half of these were poached inside Kruger National Park. And so the update, the following day, Kruger, or SANParks, updated the story, and this is a quote from their press release. In a follow-up anti-poaching operation in the eastern boundary of the Kruger National Park last night, field rangers came in contact with a group of suspected poachers. SANParks reported that a shootout ensued between the rangers and poachers. During the confrontation that happened, 2 suspected poachers from Mozambique were fatally wounded. So what's important here is certainly the death of the rhinos, but that's not the end of the story. I think what's also important here is the death of the poachers after a firefight with rangers, the fact that the poachers, like the rangers, that they were all heavily armed, the fact that the poachers were from Mozambique is significant, and the fact that the anti-poaching unit, the follow-up to this, concentrated on the eastern boundary of Kruger National Park, which is the border with Mozambique. So what I want to do today is I want to speak to this issue of rhino poaching, but I need to do so in a rather preliminary way. A lot of this is based on research I had done back in 2008 and 2009 before I even realized that rhino poaching would become an interesting and important issue. And a lot of this is based on data that I've been able to find from here, scholarly and popular articles. And I'm actually headed to South Africa next month to look deeper into this, and so I want to use this as a way to sort of frame what it is I'd like to look at. So I'm really looking forward to your feedback on this. And what I want to do today is suggest that Kruger is undergoing a dual militarization tied to this onslaught of poaching. On the one side, you have militarization affected by the poachers that are themselves tied to larger criminal syndicates. And then on the other side, you have the state response, the militarized state response. And I think I want to show the details of how this is playing out. I think the details are really interesting here. But I also want to use this as a way to place sort of a more nuanced analysis into studies of conservation and militarization. And I'll get to sort of what those debates are in the literature in a second, but I think this case actually can speak quite a bit to those debates. And I also want to focus on the complicated or the multi-layered spatiality of Kruger, the fact that Kruger is its own national park, but that it does butt up against the international border with Mozambique. That's actually a really important part of understanding the militarization that's taking place. And then at the end of the talk, I want to turn briefly to looking at the implications of this militarization on sort of two different things. One is undocumented migration through Kruger, primarily coming from Mozambique. And the second aspect I want to look at is the Great Limpopo Transfrontier Park and the impact of the potential impact of the militarization on the Transfrontier Park. And I'll explain those in a bit. Okay, so before I get to this, whoops, sorry about this. I want to situate the problem of rhino poaching in South Africa and situate it kind of globally as well. So globally, rhino poaching has been on the rise in the last few years, and this is very much tied to the demand for rhino horn in Asian markets. Rhino horn is used; it's thought to hold thought to hold medicinal properties, ranging from a cure for hangover to a cure for cancer. Scientific evidence shows that rhino horn has in fact has no medicinal properties, but nonetheless demand is continuing to grow. And today, rhino horn on the black market fetches a price of about $65,000 a kilo. So for a large rhino horn, it's sold on the user end for about $300,000. So we're talking about a lot of money. There's a lot of value in rhino horns. And so high value really translates into high incentives. There's a lot of incentives to get access to these rhino horns. And so we really have seen this explosion of rhino horn around the world, definitely in Asia and increasingly into Africa, primarily South Africa. The reason South Africa is because South Africa actually is home to the vast majority of the world's rhino population. About 3/4 of the world's rhinos live in South Africa. And so what we've seen over the last few years is this drastic rise in instances of rhino poaching in South Africa. And if you see sort of beginning, the trend really begins in 2008, where we just see these numbers skyrocket. And so this is for all of South Africa, 448 rhinos poached last year. Half of those were poached in Kruger. So Kruger is sort of this concentrated area where rhinos live, and so a concentrated area of rhino poaching. And the spike is due, there's a lot of debate about this, but I think most people agree that one of the main factors is rising affluence in Asia, that people simply have money now to buy rhino horn, which is very, very expensive. So that explains what we see here in the chart. Very briefly, I want to mention why rhino poaching is such a serious issue for South Africa. And I'm not going to go into too much detail, so if you have any questions, be sure to ask me later. But one of the main concerns with rhino poaching is the viability of the rhino population in the world. Like if that rate of increase continues, within 3 or 4 years, we could begin to see a decline in rhino populations. And so for the sake of rhino itself, this is a serious issue. But for sand parks and for Kruger in particular, there's a lot at stake in terms of the reputation of Kruger as a site of conservation, and to have sort of this onslaught of poaching within Kruger, that is a concern within Kruger and sand parks about the sort of long-term reputation of that space. There's economic concerns that the poaching could harm the tourism industry, that it could harm the legalized hunting of rhino, which brings in significant amount of revenue to the state, but also to conservation offices. There's also some concern that the rhino poaching, that it's threatening South Africa's its natural wealth and its natural heritage. And I think we see this in the fact that the rhino is on the 10 Rand bill. It's a sort of banal expression of the country's nationalism, that rhino poaching, I think, is increasingly being seen as an attack on South Africa itself, sort of on its natural wealth, its natural heritage. And then there's a very serious concern in South Africa with criminal syndicates, the growth of organized crime in the country, and rhino poaching is very much caught up with organized crime in South Africa, so this becomes a bigger concern about the territorial integrity of the South African state, of keeping organized crime sort of out of the country from proliferating. And so the issue is very much an issue about the health of rhino populations, but it's much more complicated than that. It extends beyond just the sort of rhinos themselves. Okay, so let me talk briefly about sort of some of the debates in the scholarly literature, because these are some of the debates I want to speak to in the details of the case. So very briefly, and this should not be surprising, but conservation spaces across Africa, and I think really around the world, they're often sold as these paradigmatic sites of wilderness, these spaces where you go and you visit, nature the way that God intended, that sort of the spaces that time forgot, and they're very much sold to tourists in that context. But if we step back, we see that conservation spaces are some of the most heavily regulated spaces in the world. Very heavily regulated, heavily managed spaces. And the critical conservation literature has done a very good job of looking at the way in which some of these practices that create and maintain conservation spaces are militarized practices, practices that rest on force, violence, intimidation, and so forth. And some of the most sort of well-known examples of this has to do with the creation of conservation spaces where people are violently removed from those spaces in order to create national parks. And then there's also many instances of people being barred from collecting resources within those parks once they're established. So barred from collecting food, subsistence hunting, barred from collecting forest products, used to build houses, and so forth. And the concern here is that a lot of the ways in which that barring of people from entering parks happens, that does happen through some very violent means and methods. And a lot of the scholarly debate around this issue touches on the question of fortress conservation, this sort of idea that a lot of national parks in Africa, and Kruger is no exception here, are these spaces where states have basically drawn a line on a map and said, okay, everything inside this space is a national park, and it's restricted. And that ends up cordoning off that space to a lot of local uses, including uses for food, subsistence hunting, I think being the most obvious example, but also practices that get barred from that space are more organized practices around commercial hunting as well. And I think at some level we shouldn't be too surprised by this link between militarization and conservation, in part because rangers undergo militarized training. And this is really a common practice. And it's a common practice in part because of their interaction with wildlife, that they carry big guns and they have to protect against wildlife, that they have quote-unquote bush skills used for tracking animals. These are really similar to the practices used by soldiers, and so we see sort of a parallel there between rangers and soldiers. Some of the most extreme examples of this sort of bringing together of militarization and conservation are the shoot-on-sight policies. Zimbabwe has this policy: if you're caught, if you are a poacher or a suspected poacher within a conservation area, the rangers can shoot you on sight without having to ask any questions. These have been really, really severely criticized for violating human rights. South Africa, thankfully, doesn't endorse that policy, but it is quite a common policy. So within the literature, I think there's a really common assumption, a shared assumption, that the militarization of conservation is unjustified, that it amounts to an excessive display of state power, the sort of consolidation of territory, consolidation of resources, that it further displaces and dispossesses especially local communities that have already been displaced by parks and so forth. I'm incredibly sympathetic to these critiques. I think they make a lot of sense, and I think we really have to take them seriously. But I think where this talk is coming from is my frustration with that, because I think the case of poaching in Kruger, it's one in where it becomes much more difficult to simply denounce the militarization of conservation methods. And I'm not arguing for a full-on support of militarization of conservation methods, but I am arguing that we need to bring a more nuanced analysis to this, because it is a more complicated case. And we need to do that because of the threat posed primarily by poachers who are tied to these organized criminal syndicates. I want to touch really briefly on just sort of a second trend within the militarization and conservation literature. I'm going to touch a bit on this in the second half of the talk, but this is a little less developed. Conservation spaces have also been used to fund conflict. This is the case in Kruger, where the South African Defense Force, which was basically the military arm of the apartheid state, they actually poached elephants in Kruger in order to fund the destabilization of many of the countries around South Africa, including Mozambique and Angola, sort of the two best examples of that. And so we see conservation spaces being used to actually fund conflict. So it's another link between conservation and militarization. Also, within conflict that happens in conservation spaces, oftentimes animals are used for food to feed troops. But a more sort of troubling practice happens, and this happened within Mozambique in the sort of larger regional context, of soldiers killing animals so that their adversaries would not have access to food. And so we see this sort of large-scale slaughter of wildlife during conflict. And so when we think of militarization and conservation, I think it's also really important to actually pay attention to actual conflict within conservation spaces as well. And I think what these examples force us to do is they force us to draw into question, I think, this sort of surface assumption that conservation and militarization are somehow at odds. But in fact, they actually fit quite comfortably together. And I think the problem is that that leaves those of us very uncomfortable who are committed to conservation but who are critical of militarization. Because it's sort of this linkage that we don't necessarily want to see, but in fact, there's a long history of that linkage. Okay, so I'm going to turn to sort of the meat of the talk, and that's looking at the actual militarization of Kruger. And I want to start not with the obvious place, which I think is the poaching, or with the state response side of the equation. That's the side that's received most of the attention in the scholarly literature. I actually want to start with the poaching side of the equation. And put simply here, poachers have really brought about a wave of militarization into Kruger in the last few years, especially since 2008. What this photo is a photo of rhino skulls that a game ranger that I'd spent a bit of time with in Kruger, he had collected these and he had placed these at the headquarters where he was located. It's sort of a testament to the fact that rhinos were getting poached, to kind of let people know that this was happening. And the skulls on the front, where you can see that the nose is like there's a really kind of flat surface, that's really clear evidence of poaching. Because you can see there that the horn's actually been severed there. And so for him, for this ranger, this was just sort of this testament, like, hey, pay attention, this is actually happening. Okay, so if we look at the militarization caused by poachers, I think I'm going to look at this in two different respects. And the most obvious respect, the most obvious level, we can begin to focus on the weapons, that poachers are coming in to Kruger and other places in South Africa with very high-powered hunting and military-grade weapons, and they're often using these weapons to shoot rhinos. There's other practices used as well, but definitely weapons are a common practice. These weapons are often supplied by the larger criminal syndicates that poachers are hired by, and these weapons have increasingly been used in shootouts with park rangers and soldiers who are working on anti-patrol units within the park. And according to the official press releases, it's poachers themselves who start these fights. I don't know if that's true or not, but I'm assuming it is, but there's always room to question that. And in recent years, Santa Parks has indicated that poachers are becoming particularly brazen and ruthless, that they do fire on park rangers and the military when there are confrontations. And if we look at the penalties imposed on rhino poaching, this is not overly surprising. Rhino poachers are facing a prison sentence of about 25 years right now in South Africa, so very severe penalties, which I think does explain sort of why some of these firefights take place. In addition to sort of the weapons and the sort of shootouts that are happening, there's growing evidence that the poachers themselves have sophisticated military training, and this was always sort of under the surface. People would talk about this in sort of hushed tones, but in December something very significant happened here where it's much more sort of in the open. And what I'm talking about here is 5 Mozambicans were arrested for poaching in Kruger, all with illegal firearms, with AK-47s. And it turns out that they're members of the Mozambican Armed Forces. They're currently soldiers of the national Mozambican military, and they were arrested for poaching in December. So we have that link to sort of military membership and military training. In addition, criminal syndicates are increasingly providing poachers with military paraphernalia like night vision goggles in order to facilitate their hunting and to sort of search out rhinos undetected. And so what we're seeing here, and I hope this is pretty obvious, is that the poachers themselves, again backed by these larger syndicates, that they are an increasingly militarized force, and they're willing to use militarized means to attack not only rhinos, but to attack park rangers and soldiers who are there in the park as well. Okay, so that's one side of the way in which I think poachers are bringing this wave of militarization into Kruger. I want to talk about a more subtle linkage between poaching, conservation, and militarization as well. This is one that we have to kind of turn back a bit to the regional history so I can explain why this is significant. But what I'm getting at here is that last year park officials found several AK-47s inside Kruger. These were used to hunt rhinos. And it turns out that these were weapons left over from the Mozambican Civil War that ended in 1992. And so I want to make a historical linkage here in terms of the regional militarized context and how this is contributing, I think, to the militarization of poaching, militarization of conservation, militarization of poaching in this context. So in the 1970s and into the 1980s, Mozambique underwent a very horrible civil war, and it was sort of a civil war in quotes because the war was very much provoked by apartheid South Africa as part of its larger destabilization policy. Kruger played a really significant role in this context, and that's because of its location. Kruger was on the border with Mozambique, and so it was used basically as a buffer zone to keep the fighting inside Mozambique. And it was also used as a site of military troops were placed inside Kruger. And this is a photo I took a few years ago of one of the military bases that's now abandoned, deep in Kruger, really far away from where tourists are able to go. A ranger took me out here to show me this. And these were bases that were used, again, located inside Kruger, not far from the international border with Mozambique. They were used to collect refugees that were walking through the park, who were fleeing from the war. They were used to launch attacks into Mozambique, although no one really likes to talk about that. And so we see this sort of militarization of Kruger. It's not just a buffer zone, but it's a militarized space. In addition to that, you have the ANC, Nelson Mandela's anti-apartheid political organization. They're actually hiding weapons inside Kruger during this time, sort of hiding weapons caches there as well. So it's getting militarized from the other side as well. In addition, on the Mozambican side, just across the border, you have the massive slaughter of wildlife because of, enabled, tied obviously to the war, but enabled in part because there were so many weapons were floating around and people sort of killing weapons for food, soldiers killing weapons so other people wouldn't have access to the food and so forth. And so we're seeing this sort of regionalized space that's this regional space that's highly militarized. And so at the end of the Mozambican War, the government and NGOs worked to collect these weapons, at least on the Mozambican side, that were floating around. When the Limpopo National Park, which is Mozambique's park there, right next to Kruger, that was created in 2001, when that park was created, park officials went out to try to collect more guns because everyone knew they were still floating around. But what we're seeing today is that all those guns obviously were not collected. And we're seeing the sort of re-entry of that conflict into Kruger. And I want to think about this in terms of a militarized haunting, this sort of spectral return of this apartheid-inspired military conflict back into Kruger. So the conflict might be over, but its remnants remain, and they remain in very material forms. And so what we're seeing is the sort of vestiges of this war, the guns and the bullets, that are re-emerging into Kruger, and they're being used to pierce the flesh of rhinos. And eventually these rhinos end up in these global supply chains that are supply chains organized by criminal syndicates. And I think what I'm trying to get here, see if it works, is that we need to look at the fact that the past really matters. And this is something that the conservation and militarization literature has kind of hinted at. I don't think it's taken on directly. And what I'm thinking here is Terence Ranger's book on Matopos National Park in Zimbabwe. And one of the things that he and his co-authors look at is that if we look at the history of Matopos, there's a history of very violent militarized dislocation, and that the memories of that militarized experience, they come back to haunt Matopos. Like, that history isn't over. And I want to say there's something similar going on here. But what's coming back is not the ethereal, it's not the memories, but it's the materiality of the war. It's the guns, it's the bullets that are coming back to haunt Kruger, and to haunt its sort of contemporary conservation methods. And it's a complex case because I don't in any way want to give the impression that Kruger deserves it, not at all. But South Africa isn't innocent here. Under the apartheid regime, they're the ones that are sort of fueling the war in Mozambique, and so you see these really complicated linkages coming back into Kruger tied to the apartheid state's larger regional military strategy. Okay, so that's the poaching side and sort of the militarization that's coming from the poaching side. I want to look now at the state response to poaching, because this is where sort of the second wave of militarization is coming from. Before I get into the details here, I do want to make very clear that South Africa has a very complicated and multi-layered response to poaching. The militarization is just one aspect. So for example, the state is engaging Vietnam and China in trying to pressure Vietnam and China to do more to stop things on the demand side of things. They're working to strengthen security at airports and at seaports to stop, so customs officers know what to find when they see sort of suspicious-looking packages, so they know like what to look for in terms of rhino horns and so forth. So we see all these different practices. So militarization is just sort of one of the many practices. The reason I mention that is that militarization, one of the things that's interesting about it is it's a practice that is directed at the poachers themselves. It's not directed at the larger supply chain. And so there's a danger here of sort of reifying the poacher. If I'm just going to talk about militarization, which is my focus, I really am talking about militarized practices directed at the poacher. But I don't want to sort of forget the fact that poachers are working as part of these larger syndicates, because that's really part of one of the reasons why they are so dangerous. Okay, so with that sort of caveat, I want to look at the sort of state militarization practices. I want to begin with the fact that Kruger now has about 350 rangers working in the park. It's actually not very many for the size of the park. But because of rhino poaching, Sandparks has agreed to train and hire 150 more rangers. And these rangers, all rangers, are receiving more militarized training. But the bigger, when we look at militarization in the context of Kruger, the sort of greater military push is actually coming from the military itself, not necessarily from rangers, at least not acting by themselves. And so in April of last year, after about 15 years of absence, the military returned to Kruger. And in particular, they returned to the international border with Mozambique. And this is a new military. It's the South African National Defense Force. It's not the South African Defense Force. So it's not the same military that was used under apartheid. And so currently there are 3 companies located inside Kruger with a total of 165 soldiers. And like other soldiers, these soldiers in Kruger, they receive combat training, mission training. So they are trained as soldiers. The one difference between these soldiers and other soldiers is that the soldiers inside Kruger have much more substantial weapons, and that's to protect primarily against elephants. And so they're actually better armed inside Kruger than they are outside of the park. Currently, I think we're seeing even more of a militarization because of a labor strike. Half of Kruger's rangers are currently on strike because of wage disputes, and so the state has promised to bring more soldiers in to cover that gap, especially in the context of rhino poaching. So in addition to the soldiers, we do have rangers. This is a photo of a ranger. I was out on, he let me go out on patrol with him to kind of see what he was doing. The rangers are well armed. They have, like soldiers, they have bush survival skills. They have tracking skills. They're able to track humans and wildlife alike. One important difference, and I don't know exactly what I want to make of this, but this is something that the conservation literature, the critical conservation literature, doesn't often focus on. There's sort of this conflation of ranger and soldier. Rangers' job duties are actually, I think, significantly different than soldiers. Soldiers are trained for explicitly militarized purposes. They're there to defend the border, to stop transborder crime. Soldiers are there to protect the ecological integrity rangers are there to protect the ecological integrity of the park. And so a lot of their job consists of finding animal carcasses, taking tissue samples, and bringing those to scientists to sort of understand what animals are dying of. And so theirs is not solely a militarized presence. I think increasingly it is because of poaching, but they're not there solely as the sort of military arm of the state. And so I think when we combine sort of the soldiers and rangers together, and especially the soldiers, the military side here, Kruger is becoming increasingly a militarized space. I think that's, we can't really argue with that point. And the result is an increasingly dangerous place. It's increasingly dangerous for the rangers and the soldiers, but also and especially for the poachers. I haven't been able to find exact numbers here, but over the last year, at least 10 poachers have been shot and killed inside Kruger, although I think that it's probably more than that. Sandparks does not celebrate these deaths. It doesn't glorify them, and I think to its credit it doesn't. but it doesn't mask them. It sort of lets them stand as messages to potential poachers. And it has these sort of really odd, in the statements, the media statements, these really weird regrets. Like, Sand Parks regrets the death of these soldiers, but we would encourage the community to come forward with any information. And so they're this a bit sort of disingenuous regrets, I think. And I think these numbers really do stand as sort of deterrents to potential poachers. This sort of militarized violence that ends up in the death of poachers becomes this warning to other poachers, sort of enter at your own risk. Risk of imprisonment if you're caught, risk of death if you fire on our soldiers and our rangers. It's not clear to the extent to which these militarized disincentives are working, because rates of poaching have not fallen. And the head of Sand Parks, David Mabunda, he recognized this in this quote. He admitted that rhino poachers, quote, go back home in body bags, but they still keep coming. So there is a question about the sort of efficacy of this militarization. So this is where I want to get a bit ambivalent, I think. And maybe I was telling one of my colleagues this morning, maybe I should wait till I get tenure to push this argument forward, because I kind of get slammed in the critical conservation debates here. But I feel really deeply ambivalent about this militarization. And it's an ambivalence that we don't see in the academic literature. In the academic literature, there's just sort of this assumption that the militarization is bad. It's sort of the extension of state power. It's the consolidation of territory. I think it is that, but I think that a case like this, where rangers and poachers are up against such a violent threat, it's more than that. And we have to take that seriously. I think that we do a disservice as academics if we don't take that threat seriously. Because rangers and soldiers are increasingly placed in harm's way by the poachers that are backed by these very powerful and very dangerous criminal syndicates. Poachers have shot at rangers and soldiers in Kruger. None of the soldiers or rangers have died, but they have been shot at and they've been wounded. But if we step sort of outside of Kruger, I think we begin to see this sort of seriousness of this threat a little more clearly. And the case that hits home most sort of forcibly for me is the assassination of Gilberto Vicente. Vicente was the he was the warden of the Limpopo Park when I was doing my dissertation work there. And he went on to become the warden of the Maputo Special Reserve, an elephant reserve outside of Maputo. And he was really sort of known as this obstacle to organized poaching. He was very stubborn. And in 2010, by all accounts, he was killed by an organized hit, a hit organized by a criminal syndicate engaged in poaching. And they basically, he was coming out of the Maputo Special Reserve, and they hit they just sort of shattered his truck with AK-47s, and he died instantly. And it's sort of this reminder of this is incredibly dangerous. This isn't child's play what's going on. And really briefly, I just want to give a little personal story here that, again, sort of reminded me of the danger of what was going on, or what is going on in Kruger. The last time I was in Kruger was in 2009, and I was out on patrol with a different ranger in the northern part of the park. And again, a really remote part of the park, close to the international border. No one was supposed to be out there, and we saw a truck coming at us. And the ranger was really worried, and he was assuming that this was very likely a criminal syndicate bringing contraband goods through the park. And so he pulled the truck over really quickly, and he yelled at me. He said, "Get out of the truck and hide behind the truck." And I did. There's nothing else I could do. And so he got out around the front, and he pulled his gun out, and he was aiming it at this truck. And so as the truck came closer to us, it turns out it was actually the South African police. And we were so relieved, and everyone was kind of awkwardly laughing, because it was such an uncomfortable, it was such a frightening experience, and then to have it turn out to be nothing. And it turns out it was just a miscommunication between the police and the park. But it really made it clear to me how dangerous this is, and I guess that's sort of, I want to take seriously that sort of that fear that I think I felt, but in particular that the ranger felt, because I think this is a fear that many of these rangers are sort of dealing with on a day-to-day basis of not knowing what the threat is. And so because of these sort of that experience, the death of Vicente, and the fact that rangers are getting attacked, I'm unable to write off these militarized tactics as simply signs of state excess, or as a sort of unjustified consolidation of state control. I really think there's more to it than that. But I'm also not comfortable endorsing these militarized practices. And so I think what I want to do for the rest of the talk, the next 10 minutes or so, is to throw some ambivalence in here and to look at several of the reasons why I think we need to be skeptical of these militarized practices. And so I don't want this talk to be read as sort of an endorsement of state militarized practices, but nor a simple sort of indictment of them either. I want to kind of show the complexity of what's going on here and get this more nuanced analysis. And sort of understand, I think, where we can and we really should be criticizing the militarization of Kruger from the state side, we have to look at this question of the park's spatiality, because I think this is where some of the really problematic aspects of the militarization come in. And so I mentioned here, Kruger, its spatiality is important because what's being protected from poaching is the park itself, but also very much the international border. Why that's so important is that the majority of poachers are actually Mozambicans, and that they're crossing into South Africa. And I think the sense, although I have to confirm this, is that a lot of the poachers are coming through Kruger. They're crossing the international border and directly into Kruger. And I think this helps, I hope will help me show sort of what I find disturbing about the militarization of Kruger by the state. So I want to give briefly just a little bit, go back to the history here, because I think it'll make more sense why I think this is problematic. So during apartheid, South African Defense Force was responsible for border patrol, and they, by all accounts, they were pretty effective in patrolling the border, and in many ways quite brutal in patrolling the border. When apartheid ended, the military was no longer used to patrol the border, and they were replaced by the police services, the national police services. At least in Kruger, and this is something that people were telling me in 2008 and 2009, there was a sense that the police services were really inept in Kruger, that they didn't have the bush skills, that they wanted to sit in their air-conditioned trucks all day, and that they just weren't patrolling the border the way that they should. And I think there is a national discussion, although I didn't realize it at the time, that the military should be brought back to patrol borders sort of in general. And in 2011, in April of 2011, the military did come back to Kruger. So we're seeing a sort of reintroduction of the military into Kruger that's actually pretty recent. And again, the military, they circulate somewhat through Kruger, but they really are primarily interested in controlling the international border. Okay, so I've kind of laid out this story so far that suggests that the Army has re-entered Kruger to assist with the park's anti-poaching efforts. That's true, but it's only partially true. The redeployment of soldiers along the border, it's tied to a much larger national border patrol strategy. And this is called Operation Corona. And this is a strategy to militarize all of South Africa's borders, not just the border of Kruger. And just to situate this here briefly, Kruger is located right up here. So it's actually a very small part of the border. It's an important part of the border, but a really small one. And so with Operation Corona, the military is coming back, taking over border patrol responsibilities for the entire country. Most of this centers on the country's land borders, but there is a bit of focus on the sea borders as well, especially because concerns around piracy. But mostly the Army's focusing on the land borders. And so this consists of the deployment of 22 companies, 3 of those in Kruger, and several thousand soldiers throughout the country focusing on the land borders. And the goal of Operation Corona is to protect the territorial integrity of South Africa. And what that means in practice is that the focus here is on fighting cross-border crime and illegal immigration, quote-unquote illegal immigration. Those are the two priority areas. And in fact, border security has been upgraded to a national priority, and some people, these are sort of insiders, are saying that border security is becoming such a big concern that it's actually eclipsing South Africa's focus on peace missions throughout the continent, that the focus is shifting sort of from outside of South Africa to inside of South Africa, focusing on the international borders. Well, from my perspective, and this is where I think the critique needs to come in, Operation Corona, I think the primary focus there is on undocumented migration. That the focus of the operation is to stop undocumented migration. And I think that for several reasons, but one of the biggest reasons is if you look at sort of the successes of Operation Corona, there's sort of these lists of the things that it's done, and it's like soldiers have collected, 100 pounds of marijuana and this and that, and 16,000 illegal immigrants were arrested. I mean, so the focus really is, in terms of the successes, it's on undocumented migration. That's really where the focus is here. And my concern here, and this shouldn't be too surprising, is that I think the militarized responses to undocumented migration are extremely problematic. They tend to demonize migrants, they place them in harm's way, migrants who are coming to South Africa for a better life. Unlike poachers and these criminal syndicates, migrants are typically not engaged in violent activities. They generally do not carry weapons. They generally do not engage in activities that threaten wildlife. I mean, there's a sort of a world of difference between most labor migrants and criminal syndicates and rhino poachers. And I think when we talk about Operation Corona and the militarization of South Africa's borders, we have to do so in the context of the xenophobia of South Africa. South Africa has emerged kind of year after year as one of the most xenophobic countries in the world. And this really came to an explosion in 2008 when xenophobic violence broke out and 68 migrants were, mostly migrants, 68 people were killed in these attacks. And so what I'm getting at here is that if we want to understand ways in which this remilitarization of Kruger is problematic, we have to step back and see that this is part of a larger project of militarizing the borders en masse, and understanding the ways in which the project is tied to anxieties over undocumented migration. And I'm concerned here that rhino poaching, whether it's intended or not, is being used as a justification for the militarization of the state response to undocumented migration. Like rhino poaching, which is a really legitimate concern, is getting thrown into the mix and being used as a sort of justification for a project that I think is actually quite suspect. So I'm concerned about the impact that this is having sort of at a national level, the impact on migrants. But I'm particularly interested in the potential impact that this militarization of the borders, in particular the militarization of Kruger, can have on undocumented migrants traveling through Kruger. A lot of Mozambican migrants do travel through Kruger to find work in South Africa. Many of them travel on foot. It's quite dangerous, but it's a practice that's been happening for decades. And what we see here in the photo on the left is actually the footprints of migrants who traveled through Kruger by foot the night before I took this photo. Some rangers were showing me how they know that migrants are actually walking through the park. And my concern here, I guess, exists at two levels. The first is that with sort of the heightened militarization, I think that places migrants in harm's way. You basically have a bunch of people with guns roaming around the park who are looking for people who don't belong there. And I am concerned that migrants potentially will be harmed by that. There's no indication that that's actually happened yet, but I do worry about that. I think the bigger concern here, I don't know if it's a bigger concern, but in terms of affecting a larger number of people, is a concern that this militarization of the border might actually shut down a lot of this movement through the park. I think from the park perspective, that's a good thing. But from the perspective of Mozambican migrants, their livelihoods depend on being able to move back and forth through that border that historically has been relatively porous. And to redeploy the military along that border, in many ways, I think will shut down opportunities for cross-border movement for migrants, especially poorer migrants, younger migrants that can't afford to travel by vehicle. And I actually am working with a graduate student now to look at the sort of livelihood impacts of some of these changes on Mozambican migrants. So it's speculative at this point, but we're sort of working on a project where we're to try to gauge some of those impacts. And then the final thing I want to mention here just has to do with the Great Limpopo Transfrontier Park. This is a tri-national park between South Africa, Mozambique, and Zimbabwe. And the park was opened in 2001 And the goal of the park is to bring down the border fences between the three parks, but especially between Kruger and the Limpopo National Park, and allow animals and tourists to migrate throughout that space. But in fact, what we're seeing with this Operation Corona and the reintroduction of the military is that that border is actually being fortified. Much of the border fence had been removed several years ago, but because you have this military force along the border, it's actually a much stronger force than the fence itself ever was, to have sort of soldiers up patrolling that border. And my concern, I've been quite critical of this park in my writing, but this case actually made me realize that I actually think it's a really interesting idea to have this Transfrontier Park. And I fear that the sort of reinstitution of the military along the border threatens to undo some of the gains of the park. For example, the park has been celebrated as an international peace park, but there's this sort of really painful irony of having an international peace park where you have the military going up and down the middle of it patrolling the border. And so the concern here again is just sort of what does this militarization mean for the future of the Transfrontier Park? There's been a lot of money invested in this park, and a lot of hopes have been invested in this park. This is sort of a new dawn of not only conservation, but a new dawn of international relations, of countries working together hand in hand on the shared conservation effort. What does the remilitarization of the border mean for that? I'm just really uneasy about the sort of future of the Transfrontier Park, given what's happening on the ground. Okay, that's all I have for you. Thank you very much for listening to me talk through some of these ideas. I very much look forward to your comments and your feedback, and if you think that this topic is a sort of a guy's for some really conservative ideas about like go military, you can let me know. But yeah, please do not hold back. I really do look forward to your comments. So thank you.
Thank you very much. We have a little more than half an hour for questions and comments. Since there's not a lot of us, I'll let you just direct yourself directly to Libby, who's going to stop you if there's
I have to go to a meeting, so I'd love to just comment and say that I thought you brought that together remarkably well, considering
our conversation.
No, considering that, just that you were sort of thinking out loud at that point, and now you've got to talk. But it seems to me that the conservation literature might be, and you've kind of commented on how it's not necessarily talking to these issues that you're talking about, because I might, if you were to write this up, rhino sovereignty and the geopolitics of poaching and encroaching, to me that would capture, this is in some ways a straight up kind of geopolitical border issue, because the South African state can control all the borders of the park except the international border. Mm-hmm. It's obviously got a pretty weak force along there, and